everybody, welcome. Really excited that you all have made the time to be here this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are found on the globe. My name is Audrey Tronlom. I currently serve as the Environmental Health Program Manager for the University of Northern Iowa's Center for Energy and Environmental Education. I also have the pleasure of serving on the Cancer-Free Economy Network's Network Council as an at-large member, and I also facilitate the Climate Toxics Health and Equity Group here at CFE, or the CTHE group. Now, for those of you who are unaware, the Cancer-Free Economy is a network cultivating an inclusive movement to promote healthy environments where no one gets sick because of toxic chemicals where they live, learn, work, and play. This webinar is in fact hosted by our small CTHE group within CFE, the wider CFE network, of course, and Clean Production Action. And the focus of our talk today is, well, as a team, as a small CTHE team, we've been working really hard to elevate the topic of this webinar. During these conversations over the past several months, we realized that there's been a need to focus on and highlight the very root of the climate crisis, which is burning of fossil fuels, and how burning of fossil fuels relates to toxic chemicals and human health, particularly through the network's niche lens of cancer. Now, there's no one really better to articulate these climate toxic relationships than Beverly Thorpe. I'm therefore extremely excited to be able to introduce her and today's webinar, The Big Blind Spot, Addressing Petrochemicals for Climate and Health. Bev is very well practiced at simplifying and communicating how climate and toxic chemicals, often painted as separate issues, are the same problem. When I read her report, Transforming the Chemical Industry, Safer Substitutes and Solutions for a Non-Toxic Economy, it really unlocked the whole way I thought about climate and toxics. Bev articulated the scope, scale, and urgency of the twin problem in a way that I hadn't pieced together before. Today, she'll be sharing with us the details of this blind spot and what we need to know about the work being done at this critical nexus. Deborah just dropped in the chat for you all the link to her report, so you can all follow along. Now, Bev and I have planned, as you heard, ample time for question and answers at the end of her presentation. So please submit them as they come to you via the Q&A function. I think that's the best way to do it, at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to make sure that we get to as many of those as we can at the end. Now, as Bev and I were planning this call, we very quickly realized that this really needs to be the first of many conversations about this intersection. So until those other calls are planned, please consider this a high-level discussion that just gets us all up to speed on the landscape of these interlocking issues. And I'm hoping that we can organize some more strategy-specific calls in the near future, so please stay tuned for that. And for your information, we'll just be sharing Bev's presentation out later, because there will be some links in there that you'll want to have access to. Finally, before I pass it over to Bev, I want to share an abridged bio of hers, but more about her past and current work can be found on the Clean Production Action website. Okay, after I read your bio, Bev, I'm going to hand it over to you. So Bev has researched and promoted clean production strategies internationally since 1986 and co-founded Clean Production Action as a resource to advance a non-toxic economy. Previously, she was the first clean production liaison and technical expert for Greenpeace International on chemical and waste issues, and during this time researched and disseminated the growing field of clean technology solutions to the Global Toxic Campaign. Her work on alternatives to PVC, organohalogens, and hazardous waste incineration helped drive momentum for safer substitution in company practices. As the NGO representative in the first United Nations Environment Program for Cleaner Production, she promoted the value of public participation in industrial practices. She currently promotes, teaches, and networks the pragmatic application of CPA's tools and strategies, and continues to be inspired by the scope of stakeholders involved, ranging from communities trying to understand the health impacts from oil and gas extraction, to retailers searching for ways to reduce their chemical footprint. So very happy that you're here with us today, Bev.
Thank you so much, Audrey and Deborah. And I'm going to dive in because we have a lot to cover. And as Audrey said, we hopefully will have more webinars in the future, or also just links to other people who are having webinars on this issue. So why is this called the big blind spot addressing petrochemicals for climate and health? Aha, you see it's just frozen.
Good thing we planned for this.
I know. I always seem to have a problem with advancing slides. I think, Deborah, you're going to have to take over.
Okay, will do. You need to stop sharing your screen, Bev, and I will.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Early enough that it's easy for us to make that change. I'm not sure why it appears that I have two open right now, but I think that's the right one. So Bev, you'd let me know when you need me to switch.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about the technical feasibility. I said to Deborah, if anything's going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong on this webinar. So next slide, please. Why do we talk about the big blind spot addressing chemicals? Because we are at code red for climate change, and we're also at code red for halting the ongoing toxic assault from the chemical sector. And I think this webinar comes at a very timely this week. We have COP27 happening this week and next week. And for those of you that know, in December 2015, 195 nations signed the Paris Agreement to try to keep our greenhouse gas warming below 2 degrees and hopefully to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But as the IPCC keeps pointing out, it looks like we're going to definitely pass the 1.5 degree centigrade limit, which will bring widespread devastation and extreme weather. We're already at 1.1, and we already know the impacts that this is having globally. So I think the need to mitigate every possible fraction of a degree from rising above 1.5 is absolutely crucial if we want to limit some of the inevitable and irreversible changes that we know this planet will come under. Next, please. Next slide. So why do we need to look at the petrochemical sector as it relates to the climate sector, as it relates to the climate crisis? We need to do so because, as this slide points out, the energy, chemicals, and plastic leak is strongly interrelated, and petrochemicals, which now account for 14% of oil use, is expected to drive half of entire global oil demand between now and 2050. It already accounts for 30% of global industrial energy demand, which outstrips that of the iron, steel, and cement sectors. And as Dr. Birol, the executive director of the International Energy, points out, petrochemicals are one of the key blind spots in the global energy debate, especially given the influence they will exert on future energy trends. Next slide. This is pointed out, and this is a slide from the IEA, which shows the increase in petrochemicals as the fastest growing sector of oil demand, which will account for a third of growth to 2030. That's in 8 years' time, and nearly half to 2050. It's interesting that petrochemicals are higher than the use of oil and gas for transport, as we're seeing a decline and shift in types of energy for transportation. We're going to see an increase in petrochemical production. And just as you all are aware, petrochemicals, many of the same corporations that produce both energy and petrochemicals are the same corporations. For example, Exxon is one of the biggest producers of plasticides and phthalates, and in fact is the largest producers, is the global leader in plastic production, as well as being a global leader in oil and gas production. Next slide. And unfortunately, a majority of this projected increase will go into plastics production, which we all know over 40% goes into single-use plastics. This slide, again from the IEA, just shows the different types of polymers that are set for increase. You can see at the top, you've got polyethylene, high-density polyethylene, etc. I just wanted to point out PVC, polyvinyl chloride, is set for massive increase in global production. And the production of these key thermoplastics will more than double between 2010 and 2015, which is great news for corporations like Formosa that's hoping to build the largest petrochemical and plastic plant in Louisiana, because as they say, the world wants more plastic. Our per capita demand is increasing by more than 50%. Next slide. So what happens with this plastic pollution? It's not just a waste issue, which we are all aware of as a global waste, microplastics, the entire plastic waste stream, such a small percentage actually being taken back and recycled. But it's important to understand that plastics consume 70% of petrochemicals and 90% of this 70% of all chemicals of high concern. This is a link to the plastic scorecard, a report that was done by Clean Production Action back in 2014. Still really highly relevant, I just keep going back to this report. I find it absolutely crucial that we understand the amount of hazardous chemicals that go into plastic production. And of course, toxic emissions from production and waste disposal is a huge environmental justice issue, particularly for impacted fence-line communities. I put in a photo of a demonstration that occurred in China 8 years ago. I don't think demonstrations occur that often in China, but you can see that the community was very concerned about the plans for a petrochemical plant, particularly the emissions of carcinogenic PX or xylene that local authorities said would not be a problem. All right, next slide. So we have the massive environmental justice issue. And there's a huge fight going on in Cancer Alley, Louisiana right now over the proposed Formosa plant to build what will be the world's largest petrochemical plant at $9.4 billion. The permit was rejected in 2020, and the company fought it, but again, just September 15th this year, the judge ruled against granting an air permit. Formosa plans to continue to fight this, but the community is so coordinated and so focused on stopping the production of this plant, which already occurs in a highly impacted area in Louisiana, known as Cancer Alley. In fact, since 2010, companies in the US have invested more than $200 billion in 333 plastic and other chemical projects, which are all now in the permitting process. Next slide, please. I threw in this slide of the green screen for safer chemicals because people often just think chemicals are so difficult to understand. And there is a gradation of different types of chemical hazards associated with different types of chemicals. The green screen takes a very complex issue and basically distills it into 4 benchmarks. Benchmark 1, the one in red, is the benchmark where you want to avoid. These are chemicals of very high concern, and it aligns with the criteria set up by the European Union's REACH for substances of very high concern. The back end of the green screen is very complicated. Chemicals are assessed against 18 different human health and environmental endpoints. An algorithm then puts it into one of these benchmarks, but it's a way to understand the different types of hazards associated with different types of chemicals. Next slide, please. And the reason why I wanted to raise the green screen was just, again, to show how hazardous are plastics. We know that they consume huge amounts of chemicals of high concern, but some are less hazardous than others. The red little feet at the bottom means that they're are based on green screen benchmark 1 chemicals. And again, you can see these are the styrene, butadiene, rubber, the polycarbonates, the ABS, polystyrenes, and again, PVC, which because it's on the right side of this graphic shows that there's a high production quantity of PVC that continues to be made. And then you've got benchmark 2 types of polymers, and then benchmark 3, the polylactic acids, which is a bio-based polymer, polypropylene, polyethylene. So just to give you a sense that there are some chemicals which have much higher chemical footprint than others. Next, please. And you don't need to look in detail at this slide, but I just wanted to give you a bit of the background to show you the types of primary chemicals, intermediates, and monomers to show where these chemical footprint distillations come from. And again, it's important to know which types of plastics are the most hazardous, most toxic. Next, please. So we have the situation where we're seeing an increase in use of oil and gas, an increase in petrochemical expansion, and an increase in plastics production. This is made worse from a climate change perspective. This is a big problem. But from a chemical pollution point, this is also a huge problem, because a scientific study this year confirmed that we are already at code red for global chemical pollution. And in fact, the researchers have shown that we've crossed the planetary boundary, or as they call it, the point at which human-made changes to the Earth push it outside the stable environment of the last 10,000 years. I've given you the link to the article, but as they summarize, this now threatens Earth systems by damaging the biological and physical processes that underpin all life. Those of us that work on chemicals and know about health impacts from chemicals, this is expanded into the impact it's having on biodiversity and all living systems. Next slide, please. And I just threw in this graphic from the paper because they do talk about the planet's 9 high-risk tipping points to planetary stability. They quantified the planetary boundary for novel entities, which is chemical substances, to add as one of these high-risk tipping points. And you can read about the others that we're very aware of, such as obviously climate change, land system change, freshwater use, ocean acidification. Some are at more of a tipping point than others. But it was a really interesting paper to look at how they came up with the scientific basis on what I think many of us inherently knew or suspected anyway. Next slide. And when this paper came out in January this year, international scientists, as Chemical Watch reported, they just call for a cap on the production and release of chemicals. As they point out, 350,000 chemicals are produced on the market. This is 3 times higher than many people anticipated. And I found it interesting that you're having scientists now coming out in public calling for a cap on production and release of chemicals, very similar to calls for a cap on production and release of fossil fuels and fossil fuel emissions. So a lot of synergy that is going now between the chemical energy and the petrochemical issue. Next slide, please. And I just had to throw this in. This is nothing new really, but a similar alarm was raised in the second Global Chemicals Outlook UN report in 2019, which pointed out that the petrochemical sector is the second largest global manufacturing industry, but there's a total lack of effective controls globally, which means hazardous chemicals are ubiquitous in all manner, in all media, and in people's bodies throughout the globe. For people living in fence-line communities, this is an environmental justice issue, but we're all impacted by hazardous chemicals. And sometimes in high consumer economies, sometimes the largest daily source of exposure is actually from the products that we purchase and use in our homes. So a massive problem in how we deal with this industry. Next slide, please. So, okay, we've got a chemical crisis problem. We've got a chemical pollution problem. How How do we chart a new course? Where do we go with this? Three simple words, I think, encapsulate a lot of the conversations and principles that are being drawn up. One is we need to decarbonize. We need to decarbonize the industry, but we need to detoxify and we need to democratize. These three things, I think, encapsulate sort of a good framing of what's needed. And I love history. I like looking back on history and how we got into this mess in the first place with the rise of the petrochemical sector. And this lovely quote from Barry Commoner in 1973, almost 5 decades ago, in a keynote speech, the American Chemical Society pointed out that, and this is based on his 2 decades of understanding what was going on with the petrochemical sector, what we can learn from the environmental impact of this industry is that it needs to be redesigned to fulfill the needs of society rather than its own internal economic logic, and to accord with the imperative of the ecosphere and of the enhancement of human welfare. Next slide. So transforming the chemical sector. We can't tinker around the edges. We don't have time. The problem is too immense and it's global. We need something that's very bold, visionary, but doable and based in good science. So one of the things we have to do is we have to start upstream and replace the current 7 high hazard petrochemical building block chemicals with safer alternatives. What are these petrochemical building blocks and what does that mean? Next slide. It was interesting for me to find out a year ago that basically 7 building block or platform chemicals are the basis for 90% of all organic petrochemical production. And if you take the green screen and you apply them to look at the inherent hazards of these 7 platform chemicals, which are methanol, ethylene, propylene, and butadiene, and then the aromatics known as the BTEX, benzene, toluene, and xylene. If you apply the green screen to them, you find that 5 out of the 7 are green screen benchmark 1 chemicals, chemicals of high concern. So already we're dealing with the foundation of a sector that's built on high hazard. The olefins, the ethylene and propylenes are benchmark 2, not as hazardous, but 5 out of 7, we have a huge problem. Next slide. So let's redesign from the get-go. But before that, we need to understand why this is important. Benzene's high hazards travel throughout many products. And you might not be able to see this in great depth, but benzene produced at the moment from crude oil and coal, you can see the flow chart here. This is a chart from the American Chemistry Council. Is used to make many intermediaries, some of which you're all familiar with, such as BPA, the resins, the epoxies, and then of course it goes in the polycarbonates, etc. And then it goes into many consumer products, which you can see on the right, many of which are familiar to us. But in fact, independent testing has found hundreds of popular personal care items in the US to be contaminated with benzene, which prompted several big brands to voluntarily recall dozens of products. So it's not as though it's a platform chemical that then gets somehow, benign. It travels throughout the life cycle of this chemical and into other products. Next slide, please. And any worker will tell you benzene is a very well-known carcinogen to workers and to communities that live near benzene production facilities. IARC classified benzene as a known human carcinogen, particularly for leukemia, but it also causes other suppression of immune system and anemia, etc. Just this year in May, a report that came out that showed nearly half of US refineries are releasing benzene at levels that could pose a long-term health risk. And it's interesting that I was just reading an article today where it's in the release of this more benzene than anticipated mirrors new data that came through this week in time for COP27 in Egypt. The greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas facilities around the world are about 3 times higher than their producers claim. The report showed that half of the 50 largest sources of greenhouse gases in the world were oil and gas fields and production facilities. Same sector. And I have to add, this was an interesting quote from Al Gore, who commented, oil and gas companies were the worst of all sectors for underreporting emissions. And as he said, for the oil and gas sector, it is consistent with their public relations strategy and their lobbying strategy. All of their efforts are designed to buy themselves more time before they stop destroying the future of humanity. That's Al Gore. Next slide, please. So, how do we get out of this mess? The beauty is we have principles of green chemistry and green engineering, the 12 principles of green chemistry, published in 1999, lay out a very clear set of criteria by which chemicals can be designed using renewable feedstocks with less hazardous chemical synthesis. You can create chemicals that are designed for degradation, and designing inherently safer chemicals mean you are designing chemicals with inherently low hazards. So if you think about the green screen benchmarks, green chemistry principles would not allow a benchmark 1 chemical to be designed. The benefits would include processes that are safe for local communities. And of course, using green chemistry principles, you can create safer materials for reuse in a circular economy, because the last thing we want to do is promote a circular economy which perpetuates materials with chemical high hazards. That would not be sustainable. Next slide, please. The potential exists for new platform chemicals with lower hazards. And this is really good news. It's not as though we know we need to do something, but if you want a really empowering report that gives you a sense of where we could go with this, here's the link to a report that was published this year called Transitioning the Chemical Industry, Elements of a Roadmap Towards Sustainable Chemicals and Materials, authored by Joel Tickner, Ken Geiser, and Stephanie Baima. They go into each of the potential for how we could move off this very old, centralized, industrialized petrochemical complex. What would a green chemistry revolution look like? What would new chemical synthesis look like? And this is just a quote from the report that said, green chemistry and engineering inspired research provides opportunities to create new building block chemicals and novel chemicals with lower toxicity and persistence in the environment. Next slide. So this is where it gets interesting, because we have this race to decarbonize. And in fact, the non-fossil fuel renewable feedstocks are being scaled globally. And non-fossil fuel carbon includes things like non-arable biomass, lignocellulose. People are looking at it and spending a lot of research into algae, chitin, which comes from seashells, biocrude from sewage and food waste, rich in carbon, and carbon, of course, from carbon capture. But it's important to also understand that bio-based feedstocks, and we're not going into the sustainability of sourcing these. That's another discussion. But just to know that bio-based feedstocks generally have lower chemical hazards, and bio-based products can be designed with safer ingredients. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, the current focus is rather myopic on carbon footprint reduction only. The current focus is not also integrating innovation to more sustainable chemistries. This is just a screenshot from the International Energy Agency 2013 Technology Roadmap, which shows biomass. Wouldn't it be great if we could just simply make the benzene, toluene, xylenes with biomass? We're reducing the carbon footprint. Hooray. And again, there's no integration. And I've seen recent webinars where this idea of decarbonization is the only focus on what's going on with these ideas of how to transform the chemical sector. There's no integration of sustainable chemical design with green chemistry and green engineering principles. Big problem. Next slide. And just to reemphasize, this is currently ongoing, and the US Office of Science and Technology Policy under the White House is promoting a lot of new initiatives, new labs, new decarbonizing, new efforts under the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of work and thinking going on, but it needs to be considering both how to reduce chemical footprint and carbon footprints in all their innovation grants and funding. So hold that thought. Next slide, please. And this is just to, again, emphasize in Europe, we have the same trajectory happening where BTECs can be made from bio-based carbons, such as forest residues, agricultural residues, perennial crops. But again, this will not reduce the inherent chemical hazards of benzene, toluene, and xylene. It will not protect workers. It will not protect communities. You're simply changing the carbon of how you make these same highly hazardous chemicals. Next slide. And this is encapsulated in a nice little graphic that Coming Clean did early this year, actually 2022, when we released the policy paper in the Louisville Charter, just to say benzene can be made from different fossil fuels or bio-based feedstocks, but it's extremely dangerous no matter how it's derived, and released during chemical plant fires and hurricane damage to chemical facilities, harming workers and communities. The paper does go into some of the problems of when the hurricane hit a couple of years ago and the massive chemical pollution that happened around the petrochemical plants, releasing tons of benzene into the environment. Next slide. Another example of a false solution, or shall I say too much of a myopic focus on decarbonization, is the interesting developments by the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, as they call it, provides collaborative partnerships, innovative solutions, and trusted certification for a just and sustainable transition to a net positive world. The problem is that, next slide, is that they're promoting bio-based PVC as an example of sustainability. This sustainability marketing is very problematic. One of the examples they give online is this RSB certified chemical supply chain for PVC floor tiles, which now carry an RSB certification. And they show how the bio-naphtha is mixed with virgin fossil naphtha, where it enters a supply chain in Germany. Innovin produces the chlorinated chemicals, vinyl chloride monomer, that go into PVC. And look at that, you have an RSB certified bio-PVC. This will, again, perpetuate the use and release of highly toxic chemicals throughout the material's life cycle. Again, too much of a myopic focus on carbon reduction. Next. And just to remind you, the chemical footprint of PVC is immense. Bio-PVC does not change this. It's interesting, though, that the European Union's chemical strategy for sustainability is ramping up a big roadmap for restrictions, not just on whole chemical groups and classes, but also PVC, polyvinyl chloride, is one of the things that they're looking to restrict. So it'd be interesting to see how the two worlds collide on restricting PVC from a chemical pollution and high hazard point of view versus these kind of RSB certifications. Next, please. So roadmaps to holistically transform the chemical sector is now very urgent. Again, this comes from the paper, the Tickner, Geiser, and Bioma paper. Nice little graphic where they talk about 5 conversion strategies. The first one is the chemical sector needs to minimize its process energy requirements and transition from fossil fuels to renewables. But we don't want it to be the same products. We don't want it to be the same hazardous platform chemicals and supply chains. So feedstock substitution, the industry should sharply reduce, again, their fossil fuel use, while building supplies of alternative, sustainable, renewable feedstocks. And this all comes down to the definitions of what sustainable means. But as the paper points out, again, with molecular redesign, the industry should develop innovative new platform and tunable chemistries based on the principles of green chemistry and engineering. And again, the principles of green chemistry, you can't cherry pick. There's 12 of them. You can't say, we're using renewable feedstocks. That's a green chemistry principle. You need to also be encapsulating the essence of green chemistry, which is low hazard. We have to design for chemicals that will fit into the ecosystem and not poison people. On the production process redesign, these processors should be redesigned, again, using renewable feedstocks, and work within more flexible, distributed, resilient manufacturing operations. The paper goes into a lot of criticism about how the petrochemical sector is almost like an old fossil, prehistoric sort of. It's become locked into a very centralized production, which is not feeding innovation. So the new green chemistry production would not look anything like the massive concentration of petrochemical complex you have going up the Houston Ship Canal or up Cancer Alley. And then, of course, the products would be, the product redesign would allow products that are more circular, use safer chemistries, and have lower impacts throughout their life cycle. Next, please. So last two slides on this is, how do we get there? First of all, we need to switch money. We need to remove the $20 billion a year subsidies on fossil fuel developments, which is a common cry from people working on climate change and climate crisis mitigation. But we also need to do this for the petrochemical sector and the production of chemicals, reallocate this money to safer chemical design and renewable energy systems. It's long past the time when we need to start taxing the use of hazardous chemicals, and we need to integrate chemical footprint reduction goals into all ESG reporting. Just transition plan for workers and communities. We can coalesce between on the petrochemical side as much as the fossil fuel transition planning that is much needed. And we need to scale this innovation in lower hazard platform chemicals and sustainable chemical design. An interesting initiative that's happening right now is called the Marine Chemical Pollution Initiative, which is aiming to highlight, it's an initiative by the Economist Impact and Nippon Foundation. It's to amplify the problem of chemical pollution in the ocean. And if you look at it, they have some great ideas, but not enough specificity. And I think this is where the roadmap needs to get much more specific about measuring chemical footprints, setting targets for companies to reduce this. Yeah, next slide, please. I'm whizzing through here to keep to some time for discussion. We talked about what would this new transformed chemical sector look like. The paper talks about the potential to scale benefits to local communities through smaller scale, decentralized, modular chemical and material manufacturing facilities. A lot of this is predicated on the fact that supply chains are no longer, you can't count on them. It's better to have more of a decentralized system. Designing safer chemicals will involve a variety of new technologies, such as bioprocessing, electrochemistry, new synthetic molecular processes. All of these things need to be looked at. But it will also involve a complete change in infrastructure and scale of production. This holds a lot of promise for local job creation, but when this was reviewed by many environmental justice communities within the Coming Clean Network, they were very clear that the environmental justice considerations and impact on communities from the location of these biorefineries needs to be prioritized. Local communities need to be at the table from the beginning of any proposal for new chemical production facilities. And they certainly don't want whatever it is, biorefinery, whatever, not within their communities, but the communities themselves need to be front and center in any planning on this. And this, of course, accords with the principles of green engineering, which talks about the need for local stakeholder, not just involvement, the EJ community doesn't want to be consulted. They want to be there at the beginning. Next slide. So the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals is a roadmap to transform the sector so it is no longer a source of harm to people and the planet. This, couple of these recommendations I just highlighted is actually in this policy paper, requires safer substitutes and solutions for a non-toxic economy. There's the link. Download it, and there's a lot of other resources on how to use the Louisville Charter. Please endorse the Louisville Charter after you've read it, because it is quite a unique grassroots-based, well thought out roadmap for transforming the sector. Next. And I've just left with a few questions. I was thinking, how do we better coalesce the movement that's working on climate change, the climate crisis, focused on decarbonization? And then we have the movement working on chemicals to try to detoxify our industrial systems. There's so much coalition, there's so much coalescing that is in reality happening. We need to be better at cross-talking, I would say. So just this is just off the top of my head. If you are working on climate, how could you emphasize the need to stop the expansion of the petrochemical industry and new plastics production as an essential solution to climate change and environmental justice? I know we can't work on everything, but this is the reality of what's going on. And if you were working on chemicals, how could you integrate the climate change impact of increased petrochemical and plastics production? And then two big questions, not easy to answer in the next 20, 15 minutes. How can we collectively promote the need to decarbonize and detoxify the chemical sector to try to keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade and stop ongoing global chemical pollution? And how do we promote the chemical sector transformation that is needed? Because right now it's sitting on paper, there's a lot of discussion, there's op-eds being written, but we now need to move into implementing the change that's needed. Some people say that there's a better chance of this happening in Europe than the US, where the industry is so locked in and so politically active and strong, but nothing's impossible. So last slide. Thank you very much for listening, and let's open it up for some questions. Not that I can answer everything possibly, but
but you're going to try, right?
we'll try, or I'll point you to people who could answer.
Yes. Bev, thank you so much. It's like I knew at the top that this was going to be a really clear articulation of how these things are all braided together. And you explicitly touch on climate, you explicitly touch on chemicals and toxicity, you explicitly touch on human health. Like, these are solidly tied together, and it's just a really clear presentation on how all that fits together. I have a lot to say. I know that you all have a lot of questions as well. Please drop your question and answers into the chat. I am going to take the moderator privilege and ask a question to begin, but I have been known to abuse this privilege, so please stop me by throwing your own questions into the Q&A. I don't even know where to begin here. I just really want to point out that this point that you hammered throughout your talk, that sort of decarbonization needs to go with this detoxification always, like hand in hand. These two words need to be together in the conversations that we have moving forward in our individual spaces. It's just so important. So I want to go back really briefly, I think, emphasizing a point that you made much earlier in your presentation about the relationship between the climate movement and this toxic chemicals movement, and maybe in your experience and in your work over these years, how have these movements paralleled, and how are we seeing these sort of come up together at this twin problem?
I don't see a huge, great synthesis right now. I mean, this is just my experience. I'm hoping I'm proved wrong by others on this call, but people are, and I think as I showed, the trajectory even of financing is to decarbonize. ESG targets are to decarbonize. People understand carbon footprints, carbon footprint reduction. We need to move to renewables, renewable energy. I think because a lot of people see chemicals as complicated and huge, and they can't possibly understand them. We run across this all the time in our work, and certainly all of you that work on chemicals, you know, aren't all chemicals hazardous? I mean, how do you know some are better, and isn't it about exposure? So I think one of the reasons I keep promoting the green screen is these 4 benchmarks are just an easy way to understand that some polymers are really hazardous more than others. The platform chemicals, you know, or green screen benchmark 1s, they're highly hazardous. Like, we just need better ways of talking about the intersection between plastics, which are on the increase, and which will take, you know, the petrochemical sector is set to double globally in the next 10 years. How do we look at the messaging that the global chemical sector is saying, but chemicals are essential for life. People need them. This is all part of industrialization and raising the living standards of people around the world. We need to look at the messaging that's going on and counter that and come up with better narratives. And I think we need to work much better on this carbon reduction, chemical footprint reduction for a sustainable world. We need better forms of communicating this. That's just off the top of my head. I really think there's a huge opportunity, but how do we make that happen is interesting. Just take the plastics issue. It was always considered a big waste problem. And it is a huge waste problem, but it's also a huge hazardous chemical problem. Mm-hmm. And the expansion of plastics production is going to create massive toxic use and exposure. So we ourselves, I think, need to be better at joining the threads.
Yeah, I agree with you too. So it was only in our CTHE working group, and then through reading your report, Bev, that you know, and I think I used the phrase, you know, your report sort of unlocked my thinking on this, but in planning conversations, the phrase I used in talking about your report was, it completely melted my brain, right? Because I hadn't realized that there was this, you know, there's a narrative out there that bio-based is safer, right? But that's not always the case. If benzene is harmful, it's harmful because of the chemical structure. And if you're creating benzene from renewable sources and you're mimicking the structure of benzene, it's going to continue to be carcinogenic. And that was something that, as not a chemist, I didn't realize. Okay, I need to shift us over to some participant questions here. The first one here is about PVC. So is PVC hazardous in its production only, or is it also hazardous over time in the products themselves? So, you know, using, for an example, the PVC pipe used in residential and commercial water lines, is it hazardous to drinking water?
It's interesting because PVC is mostly used in the building sector right now. It used to be used a lot in packaging. And it's definitely used a lot in the building sector. So the production of PVC is a really toxic soup. You know, you have to have the ethylene dichloride and the vinyl chloride monomer, and the production of PVC is a real fence line community issue around the world. Types of PVC, then you get a lot of PVC that's also used. You can find them in dollar stores and kids' toys. There was a big move to get some of the worst phthalates out of PVC, the soft pliable plasticizers. And some manufacturers tout this as a big way forward. But if you burn anything with the PVC, if you burn anything with chlorine, for instance, the cabling that's used in a lot of electronic equipment, the PVC cables, the power cords, when that gets shipped as e-waste, you get massive amounts of open burning in these situations which should never be handling this type of waste, but the reality is it is. And you get massive amounts of chlorinated brominated dioxin in these communities. The whole life cycle is very problematic. So when people say, well, what about PVC piping? Because it's used so extensively, people start focusing on, is there residual vinyl chloride monomer that's leaking out of the PVC pipe into the water? Is it a hazard to myself using that? this is where it becomes hard to talk about the life cycle of a polymer. It's just inherently very toxic, and it's not recycled. PVC, the Vinyl Institute has often promoted the fact that they recycle PVC. There's so many different types of PVC, it's not recycled. It usually ends up in incinerators or landfills. It's just a mess from beginning to end. But you have to think long-term life cycle. And I think this is where it becomes an issue for people saying, well, is this consumer product a hazard to me and my kid?
Right.
In some cases it is. One of the big little mascots of the anti-PVC campaign was the rubber duck, that little yellow rubber ducks, which of course were probably still are made with PVC, with huge amounts of phthalates, DEHP, and plasticizers.
Mm-hmm.
And you would not know if the plastic toy you're buying for your kid is PVC or whatever polymer, because of course we don't have labeling on most things.
Right. And so there's a question here about fence line communities, and you had mentioned dollar stores. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about how these fence line communities and how the petrochemical industry affects environmental justice for marginalized communities, because I think that's a perfect segue.
Marginalized communities with dollar stores? I missed it.
Yes, sorry. You had mentioned dollar stores, and I know that they're very frequently cited in communities of low income, low socioeconomics. And so I was just thinking that was a good segue into thinking more about how the petrochemical industry affects fence line communities. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, the immediate massive assault is, I mean, if anyone has ever, I always say to people, the best thing you could do is drive up the Houston Ship Canal. Get in a bus, get in a car, and just drive up the Houston Ship Canal and look at the reality of what these communities are facing. Or drive through Louisiana, through Cancer Alley, see what these communities are facing. And I think until you've had that full-on experience, unless you are living there, you have no sense of what EJ communities have to live with day in, day out. It's just atrocious. It makes you weep. I'm involved with the Campaign for Healthier Solutions, which is the dollar store campaign, and we're trying to get dollar stores to assess all the chemical ingredients that come through their products and sit on their shelves, and understand that there's some very highly hazardous chemicals that should not be in products on their shelves. That's a whole other issue. That's working with the retailers, which is a great campaign with the Mind the Store campaign and others. And you're seeing some progress on retailers understanding they need to set up restricted substances lists and talk to their supply chains, this, that, the other. But at the end of the day, that's one source of exposure to hazardous chemicals. But if you combine that with all the communities in the US that live within 3 miles of a refinery or petrochemical sector, it's like a double whammy on top of other massive cumulative exposures. So I think what this paper was trying to get at is we can work with retailers to get them to ban PFAS chemicals and stain retardants on chemicals. But if we're going to see a massive escalation of the petrochemical sector and plastics globally, it's, one tiny step forward and 18 steps back about the reality of what's going on. We need a much more fundamental push on petrochemical industry transformation, which is hard for people to deal with in their daily work. But that's my question. How do we coalesce and bring in the financing and the thought leadership that goes into this roadmap? We just need to do it, because it's happening in all the wrong ways right now. We don't want to see more money going into decarbonizing BTEX production. Really bad move. So sorry to bring it back up to high level.
No, I think that's the purpose of this webinar. There will be plenty of time to talk strategy in future calls. So we have a couple questions here that I'm going to try to combine because we are getting close to the top of the hour around messaging. We titled this webinar, "The Big Blind Spot." How can we amplify this message that you are sharing? How do we tie these movements closer together? And maybe you can, in your answer, address maybe some of the resistance and the hurdles that we need to overcome.
Well, I think just knowing about it, like most people don't know that the petrochemical sector uses such a vast amount of energy, and that it's set to surpass the use of oil for transport, that it is going to be, that it will be half of all oil production and use by 2050, and more to the point that it is, the whole petrochemical sector is set to double in the next few years. I think most people just don't know that. So I think we're at the education phase, but also at the discussion phase. Like, I would love to be in a room with people working on climate change and people working on chemicals and just raise this issue and say, how can we be better at messaging this? I don't have all the answers. I have ideas, but this takes a multi-group discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed that Ciel, the Center for International Environmental Law, has been putting out some great reports on the link between plastics and chemicals, which originally was the link between plastics and energy use and plastics and waste. And now we're seeing more holistic treatment of increased plastics and the chemical pollution. So I think I'm seeing a progression of people connecting the dots more, but we need a lot more discussion on this. I would love for people just to come up with some messaging, some draft messaging, and let's throw it out there and look at it.
Maybe an agenda item for our climate toxics health and equity group. We are drowning in questions on this side of the moderator box, but because we're approaching the top of the hour, I'm wondering maybe if instead of trying to answer some very specific questions that we have here, maybe you can talk about, besides sort of like this hopeful convergence of the climate and toxics movement coming together, working together, creating these messages and educating where we need to, what about this rather sticky, kind of scary nexus is making you feel hopeful? Like, where do you see that there is opportunities for us to plug in, and how do we need to be elevating our work at CFE?
On the big picture transformation of the petrochemical sector,
yes, please.
We've just got to lay down the gauntlet and say, this is what you have to do. And I love laying down the roadmap and the 5 sort of circles that I showed on the pathways to transforming the chemical sector. And again, read those fantastic 2 papers. The second one is all about how we move forward. I think we need to talk to investors right now who are looking at, and I go into some detail on this in the paper, ChemScore, which is a tool used by ChemSec in Europe. Great organization. They are now ranking chemical producers on their chemical footprint. Investors find this hugely helpful. And have a look at the ChemScore website, because it shows which chemical industries are moving towards more green chemistry principles, which ones are doing a bit and greenwashing and really not moving forward on green chemistry principles. And there are, I was talking to Joel Tickner, I said, so what examples do we know of companies that are really following green chemistry principles and coming up with new designs? And he was naming 2 or 3 that right now he just feels really needs to be elevated. We need to know who the good guys are and talk about how do we get bridge financing? How do we talk to the Office of Science, Technology and Policy about where their money and research and innovation funding is going? And we just need to raise this issue that we can't tinker around decarbonizing an inherently hazardous sector. We need a whole new way of thinking. And I think it's very analogous to people working on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
If you say to people, well, what would a distributed renewable energy efficiency, what does that look like? They have, ways of talking about it. And we need to be as astute, I think, with the chemical sector. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of early days. A lot of those papers I put out on the slides are 2022. I purposely kept it to, new sort of thinking, but it's a really exciting time to be working on this now, and you have to stay focused on the solutions. Otherwise, you go a bit mad and depressed. You can't get depressed. You have to focus on the solutions. So I think there's real opportunities from investors, from regulators, from NGOs, from environmental justice communities. I think there's real opportunities.
Thank you, Bev. I think that that's the perfect note to end on. Lots of opportunities. This is sort of the ground floor of this convergence, and we can really start to, bring a very strong voice to pulling these issues together. I think we're going to have to take a pause here. I would really invite all of our attendees to keep their eyes on their newsletters, their inboxes, so that we can keep everyone in the loop about the next conversation that we host on this topic. Again, this has been a pretty high level, but we'll really want to think about, specific policies that we can be plugging into. What are the strategies? How do we message? Like those particular questions definitely need to answer, but I think we need a bigger space for it. But Bev, you've done a beautiful job of setting it all up for us and getting the conversation going. So I just appreciate your time and your expertise and your preparation and joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Just the beginning.
Just the beginning. That's right. All right. Take care, everyone.